You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
HRN is food radio supported by you. Learn more at heritageradionetwork.org. Welcome to Pizza Quest. I'm Peter Reinhardt, and today we're going to expand again, as we've done a lot this season, the parameters of Pizza Quest to be more about quest, and today it's about Bourbon Quest. And I'm here with my longtime friend and prolific author, Albert Schmid, who has a new book out called Bourbon 101. And for somebody like me, who is a bourbon, I'd have to say not quite a newbie, but basically a neophyte. I know very little about bourbon, especially after reading your book, Albert. I realize how little I know about bourbon and how much I need to learn about it, because this is a multi-layered. It's like everything else that has to do with fermentation and whether it's bread, pizza, cheese making, whatever. There's a craft and levels of understanding. And the people who are serious bourbon drinkers, maybe they're going to be closer to where you are. But people like me just know the word bourbon. We don't even know the difference between what bourbon and whiskey is. And so I want to start with you today. And first of all, welcome you. It's been a long time since we've had a chance to talk face to face, but we go back a long way. You mentioned in your book being at IACP conferences where a lot of special things happened for you, connections that you made that eventually led to this new book. And I was at those same conferences with you. So over the years, we've, interacted a lot. But I'm excited about this new book. It's terrific. But it's not your first bourbon book, right?
It's not. Actually, my first bourbon book was the Kentucky Bourbon Cookbook, which was great. It featured over 100 recipes that each had bourbon in it. And actually, that was the beginning of the impetus for this book. So long story short is because I wrote that book, I was asked to speak on some panels that included some master distillers and also some bourbon experts. And really all I was the expert on cooking with bourbon. And so
because you were teaching at a culinary school at the time, right? At Sullivan College?
Yeah, I was at Sullivan University in Louisville, Kentucky. And so I was in the center of bourbon, the Napa Valley.
You're in the right place at the right time. Yeah,
absolutely. And so I would serve on these panels, and I would hear all of the other people speak about bourbon, and then they would come to me and I would speak about cooking with bourbon. But I was absorbing everything that everybody else was talking about. And really that, I became more and more proficient about talking about bourbon, drinking bourbon, and then, just discussing bourbon in general. So that's what this is.
So it's amazing how it's one thing can open the gateway to a whole lot of other deeper things until you go down that rabbit hole, and suddenly you are like, you're the go-to person for everything bourbon. Thus this new book, Bourbon 101, which really, takes us from the beginning and it's pretty comprehensive. This is not, maybe it is introductory in one sense, but it goes really deep. I feel like after reading Bourbon 101, I feel like I could hold my own now in a bar conversation with somebody, except I'm missing one part. And we're going to get to that part today, which is I need to know how to taste this and appreciate the nuances of flavors in ways that I haven't done before. So in part two of today's conversation, we're going to do a little tasting. You're going to guide me through a tasting as you would do maybe in one of your classes.
Sounds great.
So I know that you mentioned in the book you have a whole list of classic cocktails, or all different kinds of cocktails, new and classic cocktails. But the two cocktails that I think most people associate with bourbon are probably the old fashioned and the Manhattan. And you've written at least a book on the old fashioned. Was that yours?
I did one on the old fashioned and one on the Manhattan.
And on the Manhattan. So that kind of was a lens through which you could get into all the nuances of bourbon. But let's start with those, because again, for somebody who's somewhat, undereducated about all this, why are those two drinks the classics? What makes them so good? And then how do we go from there to becoming total bourbon geeks, and going deep?
Okay, so the reason why the old fashioned is a classic cocktail, it's really the grandfather of all cocktails. It was mentioned early on in about 1806 in a paper in the Hudson River Valley. And so somebody asked the editor. They listed, I think, a congressman's expenses, and there was a notation that there were so many cocktails. What's a
Line
cocktail?
item.
Right. And so anyway, they said this is what a cocktail is. And it was a distilled spirit, um, a little bit of sugar, a little bit of water, and some bitters. And if you think about that's definitely an old fashioned. They just referred to it as a cocktail. And then you have it sort of moving to the west, and then it's identified specifically with Louisville, Kentucky, and the Pendennis Club. But um, the it could be any spirit, so it didn't really have to be whiskey. When you get to Kentucky, it absolutely has to be bourbon.
So
Um,
yeah, and I want to get to that for sure. But before we do, I want to get back to the Manhattan then as the other classic. Well, how is a Manhattan different from an old fashioned? And again, it sounds like one of the things that the old fashioned hits on with the bitters and the sugar is that it's hitting all the different flavor zones in your
it,
palate.
It is, and as a matter of fact, it's a wonderful balancing act. For the old fashioned, one of the things that I did, I sort of imagined back to that period of time and did a quick test. Bourbon or a spirit coming directly off the still is a very, very high proof.
Mm.
And I did a bourbon that was a barrel proof, so
Uh-huh.
we're talking above 125 proof. And so
Higher than you would buy in the store.
Well, you can get 125 proof in the store now, but they to me they're not the ones that are the most enjoyable. I
Right.
usually end up cutting it pretty heavily with water to enjoy it, which sometimes is good and sometimes not so good because it brings other things out like wood that you don't necessarily want. But anyway, I did a test and it totally made sense to me that they would have used something that was barrel proof or directly off the still, watered it
Mhm.
down, sweetened it up, and then added a little bit of bitters to sort of balance that sweetness. And of course, back then, 1806, you didn't have ice as readily as you do today, so they would not have put ice in it. They probably maybe would have done maybe a lemon twist, but citrus fruit back then up in New York, probably not.
Right.
Um, and so and then as far as the Manhattan goes, the Manhattan, named after the borough of Manhattan in New York City, actually specifically named after the Manhattan Club.
Uh,
And it was a drink that was it's very, very similar in its construction to a martini.
mhm.
So it's two parts whiskey, one part vermouth. And back then, it was equal parts, and then bitters. And then you can also garnish that with a cherry or a lemon twist, and you're ready to go.
So it sounds a little bit more sophisticated than the old fashioned in that you're using vermouth instead of sugar syrup of some sort, to bring in the sweetness. But then also those other qualities of the vermouth, which is essentially grape based, right?
Right. So it's just a fortified, spiced wine. And the other piece with that, and this is kind of interesting because you sort of pointed directly to sweet vermouth, but you can also use dry vermouth or a combination of sweet and dry vermouth. And the one that I actually list in the book is what's called a perfect Manhattan, which has both the
Both. I
sweet and
noticed
the
that. Yeah,
dry.
you use both the dry and the sweet. Yeah.
Right.
So again, you're getting it's the world of cocktails has its own complexities, and so and today we're going to be talking a little bit about going straight to the bourbon, for its own qualities, and then
Right.
maybe a little bit on how it also works in these cocktails, which bring together so many other flavor profiles. So back to Louisville now. So you're living at the time in the heart of quote bourbon country. Why is it Kentucky the heart and soul of bourbon? And does it have to come from Kentucky to be called bourbon?
It does not have to come from Kentucky to be called bourbon, although 95% of all bourbon is produced in Kentucky.
Interesting.
Um, and it's kind of interesting, the geography of it. So the fact that it's in the middle, it has four seasons. You have a winter, you have a summer, spring, and fall. And then also because they grew corn. Also because they had a shipping lane, the Ohio River, which goes into the Mississippi River.
Mhm.
And then just they also have oak trees and they have lots of wilderness. And so a limestone basin for their aquifer, which it all sort of blends perfectly into the perfect location to produce bourbon.
It's the perfect storm for bourbon.
It is. It
So,
is.
and a lot of it has to do, I'm guessing, with the water, with the fact that that water is filtered through limestone, and so you've got real, sort of crisp water, clean water.
It's wonderful, wonderful water. As a matter of fact, in the book, I mentioned talked about the water. And I have a sister, Gretchen, who lives up in Baltimore, Maryland, and I probably shouldn't have said that because she loves Baltimore and does not want anything bad said about Baltimore.
Well,
Um,
Baltimore has its charms, but it's not known as bourbon country, right?
Right. And she was out and she tasted the water in Kentucky, just the tap water. And the
Uh-huh.
tap water is just stellar. It's absolutely fantastic. She said, "This is incredible." Because originally she was looking for a bottled water. She said, where can I get a glass of water? And I said, just from the tap. And she said, "This water's just amazing." And it is. It's absolutely amazing water. The
It's such a
reason why
pleasure for most of us to be able to drink water from a tap that we don't feel like has been adulterated.
Right, right. And I feel her pain. We use a lot of bottled water where we live now. So the tap water is okay, but it's not like it is in Louisville, Kentucky. So
But as you said, you can make bourbon anywhere. But what defines bourbon and differentiates it from, let's say, whiskey in general, or sour mash, or hooch, or any of the other things or Scotch?
okay, so well, Scotch is made in Scotland, and Irish whiskey is made in Ireland. Canadian whiskey is made in Canada. Tennessee whiskey has to be made in Tennessee. Okay.
Okay.
Um,
That
but
sounds like the basic, the stuff, but they're different and similar at the same time.
Absolutely, absolutely. So what makes bourbon is a series of regulations that were laid out, and it's actually a pretty extensive list of regulations. For example, the mash that you make, which is kind of, and when we talk about fermentation and distillation, and you can talk about bread, you can talk about whiskey or beer or almost anything
Mhm.
that's fermented. So that mash has to be at least 51% corn. So that's the minimum.
That's for sure a defining quality that differentiates bourbon from rye or Scotch or anything else.
Absolutely. It also has to be aged in a brand new white oak barrel. It can't.
A barrel can only be used one time per batch, right? And that's to be used for something else after that.
Correct. So, and there's a huge market for Scotch makers and Irish whiskey makers and Canadian whiskey makers, and also for beer makers. They get bourbon barrels and then they age their product in those, and they get the benefits of the leftover bourbon.
But why wouldn't a bourbon maker be able to get a second batch out of a barrel?
Because by law they can't. And
That's just
so
simply a legal thing. I mean, do you
it's
think there's a qualitative
well,
function
so
there?
one of the things that you can tell is you can, and now this brand new barrel is charred on the inside, so it's nice and they don't do just a simple char like sometimes winemakers will do what's called a toast. So they just toast the inside
Uh-huh.
of the barrel and you get a nice toasty oaky kind of flavor from that. This is charred and they do it to an alligator char, which makes it look like the back of an alligator.
Uh-huh.
And so you pour the whiskey in there, it takes on this incredible amber color, darker than anything that you can get in Scotland or in Ireland, and because they're using used barrels.
I say
And and
they've
so
lost a lot of that char. Yeah.
right. And so one of the practical tests that I suggest in this book is to pour 3 or 4 glasses of different whiskey. One is a bourbon and the others have to be something else, not Tennessee whiskey. And we'll get to that in a minute.
Uh-huh.
But basically, you can tell the difference just by eyeing it. You can look at it. and the darkest one in that group is going to be the bourbon. Always. And it doesn't matter whether or not it's been aged 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 10 years. It's the darker one is always going to be the bourbon. And the darkest one is going to be the oldest bourbon, usually.
Interesting. So now you mentioned Tennessee whiskey. Jack Daniel's is famous also for charring their own barrels.
Right.
What differentiates a Jack Daniel's style Tennessee whiskey from a Kentucky style bourbon?
So there's an added process called the Lincoln County process Jack Daniel's, there's also George Dickel, both of those. And then there are a few other smaller companies that are now producing Tennessee whiskey. And so there's that final Lincoln County process. A Lincoln County process is charred maple oak or maple wood, and it's charred down, and then they use it as a filter. So as it comes off the still, they filter it through this charcoal maple, and it adds a little bit of a flavor. It also adds that extra element, but by any standard, Tennessee whiskey could qualify to be bourbon. It just has that extra process. And then, of course, Tennessee whiskey has to be made in Tennessee.
So the filtering process is through maple, but is it aged then in an oak barrel?
It is.
So it uses both maple. Well, there's a distinction right there. I'm sure the Tennesseans are quite proud of the fact that they've added this new nuance and level of flavor development. Really,
it's absolutely fantastic.
Well, we're going to taste some Jack Daniel's later in our tasting portion, so we can see if we can. Now that I know, understand it, I'll see if I can see it. Can I taste it? Can I identify that subtle difference? But so otherwise, it would qualify if it's made with 51% corn or more it's a bourbon style whiskey,
as long as it meets the other requirements. So one of the requirements is that it can't come off the still more than 160 proof or 80% alcohol by volume. It can't. It has to go in at about 125 proof. So in between the still and the barrel, you're cutting it with water to get it down to 125 proof. And then when it comes out of the barrel, when it's bottled, you can go anywhere from what it comes out as. And sometimes, and this sounds counterintuitive, when it's in the warehouse or the rick house, it may increase in alcohol. So what happens is some of the water may evaporate, and you may end up with not 125 proof, but maybe 132 proof.
Because it's more concentrated then, and so that's where the master distiller comes in. It's like the master winemakers. They have to get it all right for the end user.
Correct. And so then it can only be cut to 80 proof. So, and what I mean is it can be anywhere from what it comes out as the barrel to 80 proof, but 80 proof is basically the bottom of the proof level. You can't go below 80. And it doesn't mean that that's the bottom, like it's the worst. Some of my favorite bourbons are actually at 80 proof. So.
Well, Albert, one of the things I love about the book, the way you've structured it, because, and I know this, and maybe not all the people who read your book will know this, but you're an educator. You've taught at universities, culinary universities. And so you approach, your writing as an educator and a teacher. So you've structured the book really brilliantly. You've got 10 distinct lessons, quote lessons. And at the end of each chapter lesson, you've got a quiz. And then at the end of all of the lessons, you've got a final exam. I'm just going to read a couple of the final exam questions. And then when we come back in segment 2 and we start tasting, hopefully our viewers and listeners will be able to maybe answer these questions, or maybe I'll be able to answer them, as we go through it. But we use them as a starting point. So some of the questions you include is, which of the following bourbons is considered a classic recipe or a classic bourbon? And you list a couple brands. And then another question is, which is considered a wheated bourbon? And the third one was, which is a high rye bourbon? So right there, you've got 3 categories of bourbons. I don't know if everybody knows this, but maybe the serious bourbon drinkers do. I certainly didn't realize that there were these 3 distinctions. And then you've got some that are like a hard to find bourbon. What is a hard to find bourbon? There's some that, are just so specialized. And there's the 4 answers for this, and hopefully we'll be able to answer this in part 2, is it can be either called a goat, a unicorn, an elephant, or a donkey. And my gut tells me one of those. I think I know which one it is, but I will come back to that. And then you've got small batch bourbons. You've got a whole language in the book of bourbonology, so to speak, terminology that people know, and then all the terms for how a drink should be poured. And anyway, the book, this final test has about 60 questions, and having read the book quickly just once, I feel like I can answer maybe 30 of them. But I'm going to have to go back and read the book again now to be able to pass this exam, because I know I wouldn't pass your course if I tried to take the test today. And so when we come back in part two with Albert Schmid, the author of Bourbon 101, Albert's going to guide me through a tasting, and as we're tasting, he's also going to explain some of these terms of high rye and high wheat and classic, and then we'll continue on. I feel like we're going to have you back for another session, because we're only going to scratch the surface in today's episode, but it's going to be a deep scratch. So Albert, if you'll join me in part two, all of you who are listening or watching, please come back in part two for Bourbon 101 on Pizza Quest today with Albert Schmid. See you soon.
This episode is supported by HRN business member Radcraft. Beers and spirits should tell stories about brands, and Radcraft loves a good story. Radcraft provides communication support for the beverage industry, from breweries and distilleries to maltsers and their affiliates. Radcraft's partners are makers of thoughtful products and cultivators of radical ideas. Learn more at radcraftbeer.com. Radcraft supports HRN's creative, educational reporting and storytelling that drive conversations to shift the way we think about food.
Welcome back to Pizza Quest. I'm Peter Reinhardt here today with Albert Schmid. We're doing a Bourbon Quest episode, and Albert has the author of the new Bourbon 101. I'm going to learn everything that I should have known for many years. But as somebody who didn't grow up as a serious drinker, I had cocktails here and there, and I love cocktails. But I think the thing I liked the most about cocktails as a neophyte was the sweet syrups and the bitter, all the other things other than the whiskey. And I was missing out on the nuance of the whiskey. And then later, as I, living in wine country, I learned a lot about the levels of nuances of wine, and realizing in reading your book that there are as many distilleries just in Kentucky alone, let alone nationally, that as there are wineries, all with their own secret proprietary formulas for how to make bourbon. And so, as we've been learning, so far, Albert, and I want to talk briefly about this, and then maybe more as we're tasting, and we can embellish on this. Is first of all, what is the name bourbon? What does it refer to? Where did that come from? And we did already talk about what distinguishes it from other whiskeys, but what about that name bourbon?
Well, so there are competing theories. Okay, so the first one, and this one actually is promoted by a bourbon scholar whose name is Mike Veach, who lives in Kentucky. Amazing, really brilliant man. And he theorizes that bourbon got its name because it was loaded onto flatboats. It traveled down the Ohio River all the way down the Mississippi River to New Orleans, and then was promoted and sold on Bourbon Street. And so
Bourbon Street predates the term bourbon for the whiskey?
It does.
Wow.
Or it's about the same period of time. But you have to think of New Orleans. I mean, New Orleans, the Bourbon Street's been around for an extended period of time and heavily influenced by the French and the Spanish.
Yeah. So that's kind. So that would refer to the bourbon family tree, or whatever it's called, the hierarchy of the Bourbon clan, and then comes back up from New Orleans, and then somehow Kentucky latched onto it and said, "Okay, we're making this stuff here. They're selling it down there." Did they just change the name of the area that it was made to Bourbon County?
Well, actually, so Bourbon County, very large. Originally, it was one of the really large counties, one of, I believe, like 6. So if you can imagine Kentucky being split into only 6 counties, this was massive, and it was the closest one to Virginia, and clearly named for the Bourbon family, who supported us, the Bourbon dynasty that supported us during the Revolutionary War against the British.
Wow.
And so it was sort of and anyway, so that's one of the other theories is that it could have been named for Bourbon County because that was where it was first produced. And there's no doubt that it was first produced there. But again, in that larger Bourbon County place. So, and then the third one is that they just directly named it after the Bourbon royal family as opposed to Scotch or Irish whiskey. And so they wanted to name it's a whiskey for sure, but we're naming it Bourbon after the Bourbon dynasty.
And we're giving a little thanks to the French so it's a patriotic drink, basically, bourbon.
Absolutely it is.
Yeah,
absolutely.
All right. And so I've got my little bourbon bar set up. I've got four versions of whiskey here, three of which are technically bourbons, and one is a Tennessee whiskey, Jack Daniel's, which is probably the more well-known of them. But as you pointed out, there are many Tennessee whiskeys, just as there are many Kentucky whiskeys. So we're going to taste these, and I've set my little shot glasses up here with a little bit of ice, which is melting now. So I'm going to be pouring my bourbon into a glass with either ice or water, which you had advised me earlier was a good way to open up some of the flavors.
It is. And so one of the first things that I'm going to ask you to do when you're tasting it is go ahead and take your Jim Beam and. We'll start with that one. And what I want you to do is don't pour it into the glass. What I want you to do is take your hand here and put the bottle up against it. Pour just a little bit into your hand and then rub the two together.
Yeah, wow. It really opens up the aromaticity of it. Yeah,
it does.
We did a similar thing when we did a mezcal show last year, and then tasted the mezcals the same way it's almost like I could get off just on doing this without even imbibing and drinking it because it's so pleasurable to the aromas that emerge from the grains that have been distilled.
I agree, and one of the things that I love about bourbon is cooking with bourbon or baking with bourbon because you get this aroma all the time in the kitchen. So it's And
as I'm smelling it, I'm just trying to define for people who are listening what I'm noticing. I mean, it's the alcohol burns off real quickly because I rub my hand. So I'm really smelling the essence of the grain that has been distilled. I can't say that I notice corn. I know that you mentioned in your book that you didn't even think you could drink bourbon because you have a corn sensitivity, but that whatever it is that you're sensitive to corn disappears in the distilling process. So late in life, you discovered that you could drink bourbon and you're going, oh my God, what have I been missing all this time?
Right. So my dad was a bourbon drinker. His favorite was W.L. Weller, which actually he would be very surprised to find that W.L. Weller is like one of the most sought after bourbons, currently.
Really?
He was very proud of being fairly simple, and what I mean is that he had a doctorate degree in ministry, but he was always wanted to be approachable. So he didn't want to be viewed as arrogant or untouchable. He was very much a man of the people. And so, his W.L. Weller sort of reflected that back then. And he would be thrilled.
He's a man of the people, basically.
Absolutely. So,
well, the aromas are just, I can't even say that there's one thing that I can identify in the aroma. Maybe we'll get it more as we taste and smell at the same time. But there's, I wouldn't say caramel is not the right term for what I'm smelling, but what you're gonna have to do if you're listening is when next time you open up a bottle of any bourbon or any whiskey at all, try the hand test. Get a little bit on your hand, rub it, release all those aromas, and take a good deep whiff and enjoy that before you enjoy it further in the glass.
You bet. All right, so
should I pour this?
Yeah, go ahead and pour that onto your ice cube.
Okay. I've got a small little, not even an ounce, up to probably half a jigger, a fourth of a jigger or so.
Okay.
I've got my ice. I've got this. I'm holding up my glass to the light, and I'm seeing, again, an amberish reflection.
Okay. So you have Jim Beam. I also have some Jim Beam in my glass.
Okay.
Okay. So now what I want you to do is, you know how in wine tasting you hold it up, you look at it,
Yeah.
swirl it,
Swirl
and
it.
then smell it. But before you smell it, what I want you to do is part your lips when you smell it.
Uh-huh.
Okay. So what you're doing is if you don't, what ends up happening is your olfactory senses are overwhelmed with the alcohol.
So by simply opening my mouth, the alcohol goes into my mouth, and the other aromas go into through my nasal passages.
Right. It mutes the alcohol just a little bit.
Interesting. I can see the difference. Yeah. All right.
So, all
So I've
right.
got
And
the nose, so to speak, and I'm swirling it and seeing the legs of the beverage kind of drifting down the side of the glass.
absolutely. And what that has to do with is the viscosity of legs are
Yeah.
all about viscosity. So, all right. And go ahead and sip it.
Mhm. I'm
And
swirling it around my mouth,
okay. And just allow it to,
slide down.
cross your palate and,
Yeah.
you know,
It changes, of course, the bite of the alcohol up front, but then the after flavors of the whiskey itself kind of permeating. Then,
absolutely.
can I enhance that by again bringing more air in, like you do with wine? Aerating it at all? Does that help?
Well, so what I would do is I would aerate after. So once it's gone down, one of the things people sometimes when people drink alcohol, they distilled alcohol, they tense up.
Yeah, yeah.
And okay, so one of the things that you can do is just breathe in
Uh-huh.
and then out through your nose, and that'll cool that sensation in your mouth so it's not too hot. And then also it will pass the flavors and the aromas through your nose.
And again, it's been a minute since I've swallowed, but I'm still tasting. I'm still enjoying the flavors of the bourbon, which I guess it gives it. Part of what's so great about it is it's not just you shoot it down, you give yourself a little neck rub, and then it's over. You should take some time to enjoy the afterglow.
Absolutely. And that's one of the great things about whiskey. Whiskey drinking is 100% pleasure. And so, I heard Jancis Robinson once talk about the difference between red wine, and white wine for her was all about pleasure. And that's the way I view whiskey, is that whiskey is supposed to be pleasurable. And so, and bourbon in particular. And so you just sip it and then go about doing what you're doing and then sip a little bit more. And so
Yeah.
if you're watching a horse race, or if you're watching, football, or just enjoying friends.
Yeah, and stretch it out and enjoy it. Now, Jim Beam is the one we started with. What kind of bourbon is this? Is this a classic bourbon?
This is a classic bourbon. Now
It's got the 51% or more of corn, but it
right.
doesn't have a high percentage of wheat or rye. Is that
Correct.
right?
It probably has a little bit of rye and a little bit of barley, and then and probably no wheat. Although it may have a little bit of wheat. Jim Beam is one of those classic bourbons. Now they do some high rye bourbons also. So like Basil Hayden is a great example of a high rye bourbon that is made by Jim Beam. So
I see. So they've got divisions within the company that make the different styles of bourbon. But
right, different brands. Yep.
There's a reason why Jim Beam is, when if people don't know anything about bourbons and they don't have a favorite, they're going to say, okay, well, name me 5 bourbons. There's a chance they're going to probably say Jim Beam because everyone knows about Jim Beam.
Well, it's one of the best-selling bourbons in the world. So, and I believe that Jim Beam is like the best-selling bourbon in the world. So when you talk about bourbon, Jim Beam is one of the ones that people think
it makes
of.
a good benchmark then for us to start with. So we say, okay, this is a classic bourbon. And there's a reason why it works. It's got, I guess every distillery has their proprietary secret blend of grains that they don't want to tell anybody, how they do it. But other than that, it works across the board. It's a really good all-purpose bourbon.
Absolutely. And you were talking about proprietary blends of grains. And one of the interesting things is that some of the distilleries are becoming more transparent about what grains and how much. And so I believe that one of the bourbons that you have, they're very specific about it's 60%
They give it to
corn
you.
and 20%, and 10% this and 10% that. So some of them are very transparent. And
Very
by the way,
generous.
51% is corn is sort of the low end. Most bourbons have somewhere between 60, 70, 75, and there are a few that have 100% corn. So they have no other
Really,
blending
100%
grain.
corn is still bourbon. Well, as we've been doing, I've been continuing to sniff this particular Jim Beam, and one thing that finally a flavor emerged in my head that let me ask you if this is a common association. I'm smelling vanilla.
Oh, absolutely.
Vanilla, a flavored profile that's associated with bourbon in general or particular bourbons.
Vanilla because of the wood. And so that toasted wood that we talked about in the first section of this, it gives a lot. Sometimes you get a little bit of wood or oak, but you can also get baking spices, vanilla. And so
it feels like there could be some other spice notes in there that if I'll keep sniffing it after we finish this interview until I can dial it in. But I want to move to a second one here. Now this one is another famous brand, well-known brand. It's my wife's favorite brand for cooking with. She makes a bourbon pecan pie, and she insists that it has to be made with Maker's Mark. So I've got a Maker's Mark here with its distinctive red wax seal. I'm going to pour it into a glass in which the ice is almost melted completely. So it's cold, but not icy anymore. And you told me earlier, some people prefer water. Some people prefer ice. I like it. I don't know. There's a coldness to having it over ice. And this is the coldness part of opening up flavors, or is it more that we like our drinks cold?
Well, so as far as opening up flavors go, it has to do with the amount of alcohol. So the higher percentage of alcohol, the less you're going to be able to taste. As you reduce the alcohol, because you'll be overwhelmed by the alcohol. So as you reduce the alcohol, what ends up happening is that it does open up. You're able to detect sort of details of the bourbon. Now, interesting, the Maker's Mark, and I have a glass of Maker's Mark in front of me also. That's a wheated bourbon. So there's that back end. So it has the corn, at least 51%, much higher usually, a little bit of barley, and then it has that wheat.
Does it have to have a minimum amount of wheat to be a wheated bourbon?
It depends. Usually about 15% is pretty
so it's
standard.
Not like wheat's not the dominant. Corn is still dominant, but wheat is a higher percentage than in the classics.
Correct. And it'll have a sweeter taste to it.
Because of the wheat.
Because of the wheat.
Okay, let's find out. I've done the hand test. It definitely has a slightly different aroma than the Jim Beam. And so I'm going to try and take a look. It does taste sweeter.
It does.
Yeah.
And so this falls in line with that W.L. Weller that I was talking about earlier. So W.L. Weller is a wheated bourbon. Maker's Mark is a wheated bourbon. Now, I wanted to point something out real quick, and I just thought about this. If you hold the Jim Beam bottle and the Maker's Mark bottle up next to each other, okay? All right. And look at the word whiskey.
I see whiskey and under the word Maker's Mark, and I see whiskey under the word bourbon.
Okay. And one has an E and the other doesn't.
This Maker's Mark, the whiskey. Oh, yes. Jim Beam whiskey spelled Key and Maker's Mark KY.
Right. And that comes from the two different traditions, the Irish whiskey with the E and the Scottish whiskey without the E.
Oh.
And so the Samuels family is very proud, has very proud Scottish heritage. And so that's part of the reason why they took the E out, or they just, use the word whiskey without the E. You'll see that also in another one. So we're going to taste Jack Daniel's. The other big distillery is George Dickel down in Tennessee. And George Dickel, he was German, not Scottish, but he said, my whiskey is just as every bit as good as Scotch whiskey, so I'm going to spell it without an E.
Interesting. So there's a lot of little in-jokes, so to speak, a story within the story, or backstory, so to speak. But I'm just thinking now, again, trying to connect the dots. Is this one of the reasons why on the Maker's Mark being a little sweeter, that why my wife might prefer it in her baked goods, is because it has that more sweeter tones?
Absolutely. And it's also, I think, why my father preferred wheated whiskeys. And I completely get it. I understand.
Interesting. And that, which we'll come back to later again, but it would probably explain why certain bourbons and whiskeys are preferable for certain cocktails, because of the amount of natural sweetness that they have or other flavor tones. Now I've got two left here. One is called a bourbon, but it comes from out of the bourbon territory. It's out of Kentucky, and that's from Colorado. I've got one from Colorado. I think you've got one from North Carolina, and I also got the Jack Daniels. Should we go? Which one should we do next? The Tennessee or the other bourbon?
Let's do the other bourbon.
Okay,
and then that way you'll have a good. And so
I've got a bottle here of Law's Whiskey House, 4-grain straight bourbon from A.D. Law's in it says Denver, Colorado. I'm wondering if it's from Breckenridge or some other part of Colorado, but it's also, just comparing it to the Jim Beam, it seems like the colors it's darker. It's got more caramel. And I know you said in the book that you cannot add caramel. It's not legal to add coloring to your bourbons to make them darker. So that has to be from the barrel?
Has to be from the barrel. And so, and which is interesting because other whiskeys don't follow that rule. Okay, so some of them, if the master distiller is unhappy with the color, what they can do is add a little bit of caramel coloring. So this one is from your neck of the woods. It's the Old Nick Williams Company in Louisville, North Carolina. And let's see. Okay, here we go.
And yours looks pretty dark too.
It is, and it's also a numbered bottle, which means, and so this was from the first batch, and it is the 158th bottle. So this is back when they were brand new.
So does that add value, the fact that it's a sort of a numbered edition, or is it marketing?
Well, I think part of it's marketing. I mean, it's nice to know how many bottles that they are producing, and it also is nice to know that, like, this is the first batch. It's one of those, I guess one of those selling points. It's sort of like Pappy Van Winkle, that, unicorn of a bourbon.
Oh, yes, right. You answered one of the questions.
Yes.
Unicorn. All right. I know the answer now to that question.
So, and it's really interesting because what Pappy Van Winkle has done, and Julian Van Winkle is the owner, has done so well with that, is he has traded basically on scarcity. So he doesn't produce a bunch of it. Yeah. He produces just enough, and then people come after it because he has a good reputation. And so
partly value, partly perceived value, but it's great marketing, and it's also, manageable, smaller batches. Now the first flavor hint that I get from this bourbon tastes more peppery than the other two that I've tasted. Now this is a 4-grain. It says it's calling itself a 4-grain, which means it's got to have corn, probably wheat, barley, and rye. I'm guessing those are the 4 classic grains. But why would it be more peppery?
Well, that's the rye coming ahead, sort of coming out in it. And so it's sort of taking over, and rye tends to be a little bit peppery. And so
yeah, it's definitely more peppery. And I guess for people who love rye whiskey and love the more peppery flavor tone, because in the book you identify 6 flavor zones, not 5 like everybody else. Most people understand sweet, sour, bitter, salty, and umami. But you've added a 6th one, and that is spicy.
is
right?
spicy. And the
Yeah,
reason is that spicy doesn't really fit into any one of these other five. And as a matter of fact, it's kind of a combination of all of them. And spicy tends to overwhelm the palate.
I see. So let me just okay. So we've got a spicy, maybe a little higher. We know there's higher rye in this than maybe in the others to give it that spicy, peppery quality. We've got one more, and I don't want to run out
Okay.
of time before we get to taste the Jack Daniels. So I'm going to put a little bit more ice in my glass. Pour out some of this melted water, and I'm going to put some Jack Daniels over ice. But it's interesting now that you're opening up my understanding, the so many nuance variations of flavor in bourbon. I'm going to put a little of this Jack on my hand also. This hand test I'm loving because I'm a big olfactory guy, so. It's a much different flavor tone there in the aromas. It's very, to me, very balanced. And that may be that filtration you were talking about. Okay. I'm going to try a little swig of Jack. It's smooth.
It's very smooth.
As opposed to the peppery laws, which was not smooth. It was like, wow, punches you right in the tongue, and then you kind of kick back on it. This hits you right from the start. It's kind of smooth going down. Is that maple filtration that's causing that?
Part of that is the maple filtration. Part of it's the mash, but it's definitely that maple filtration.
So probably a low amount of rye because there's not much peppery, but they're most likely, you say maybe the second grain of choice is typically barley in most of whiskeys.
It's usually barley, and then what they do is back that up with, and again, bourbon can be 100% corn. So it's whatever the master distiller wants.
We don't know what Jack Daniels, what their blend is, but to make it this sweet, there's got to be some wheat or barley in there, right?
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
This is amazing. It's amazing that, like I say, we're just scratching the surface, and I already feel like I'm hundreds of miles ahead of where I was before we started. And maybe I'm just catching up to a lot of our listeners who are already experienced drinkers. They know, when they go into a bar, they know how to order it. They know what to ask for. The terminology is even new to me. I was sitting with somebody one time and they ordered, I don't know, a particular whiskey, and they wanted it neat. And I'm thinking, what the hell does neat mean? And experienced drinkers know that, but I don't, so what does neat mean?
So neat just means that it's just straight up.
Straight up. That's the case. Well, that makes sense. Okay. So they're saying no ice, no water, just give it to me straight. Right. Because that's the way I like my whiskey.
Right.
But I like it with ice. For some reason, I like it cold, and I like the way it feels on my tongue cold. And I'm going to always punt back to what you said. It's all about enjoyment. So you want to do it the way, you don't want to feel guilted into having it a certain way when you like it a different way.
Right.
Which then leads us to a whole other conversation, which will have you back for a whole show on cocktails and how we then use this, if other than taking it neat or straight up, also the best way to blend it, to make these delicious cocktails, because we're in a new era of mixology now, and people are coming up with all sorts of creative cocktails.
Oh, some of the mixologists and bartenders out there, they're creating just amazing cocktails. Very creative. They're using all sorts of new techniques. I was lucky enough to be a judge at a bourbon contest in Louisville, Kentucky, where chefs were paired with bartenders. The chef would cook with a particular bourbon, and the bartender would make a cocktail out of it, and then they would serve the two together.
Wow. That's what takes you back to your first book, where food, bourbon, and food.
Absolutely.
With bourbon, yeah.
And part of the reason why I was able to serve as judge was because of that book. And so anyway, and I talk about that in one of the lessons, where it's absolutely amazing what you can do with bourbon outside of just drinking it, although that's enjoyable. But the main thing to remember for your viewer is that they need to enjoy it on their terms, and they need not to. We've featured several different bourbons today, but they need not to listen to other people people. They need to listen to their own palate.
And the only way you're really going to know what you like is you have to do some sampling. You've got to do some tasting. Is it?
Absolutely.
I know that when I was in Scotland, I knew nothing about Scotch. Just like this, I went into a pub and I said, "Teach me, teach me tonight how to appreciate Scotch." So he poured out 7 different Scotches from the least smoky to the most smoky or whatever, and all different everything in between. And I left there. I could barely walk out of the place, of course. But at the same time, I felt like I knew a whole lot more about Scotch whiskey than I did before I went in. And I know that there's all these nuances. But bourbon really is, or let's say bourbon style whiskey and corn mash whiskey is really the American whiskey, as opposed to Scotch or Irish whiskey, which are based in, or vodka, or gin, or all the other alcohols that are based in different kinds of foundations, right?
Right. And as a matter of fact, that's one of the rules of bourbon, is that bourbon must be made in the United States. So, it doesn't necessarily have to be made in Kentucky, although 95% is, but it must be made within the borders of the United States.
So you can't make it in Canada and call it bourbon. You have to call it Canadian whiskey.
Correct. And so, and you're seeing some really incredible expressions of bourbon from all over the place. There's one just down the road from me at the St. Augustine distillery. And the first time that I heard that they had a bourbon, I sort of raised an eyebrow and thought, And I talk about this in the book. Some of the ways that I have, and I'm going to show you a bourbon that we have not discussed yet. It's Woodford Reserve. Okay?
Oh, yeah.
And I start with a little bottle. So if a little bottle, a 375 or even a 50 milliliter bottle is available, that's what I buy. And then that way I can taste it without spending a lot of money. And so that's what I did, was bought a half bottle of the St. Augustine bourbon and really enjoyed it. And so now we have a full bottle on because it's from Florida and that's where we live. But we also have a lot of Kentucky bourbon. And being a native Texan, I have some Texas bourbons too.
It sounds like you've you have obligations to fulfill, having lived a lot of different places. I know you're in Florida now. Where are you teaching now, Albert?
So I teach at the Auguste Escoffier School of Culinary Arts.
Fantastic. Wow. Well, it's been a great journey that you've been on, and it's been fun to catch up with you today, but also over the years to share, every time you move, we reconnect where your latest, and the same with me. I've moved a few times. I'm going to go back to the quiz for a second before we run out of time. Go back to those early questions. Remember, there's 60 questions on this final exam. Which of the following bourbons is considered a classic bourbon, a classic recipe? Ancient Age, Elijah Craig, Maker's Mark, which we know is not a classic because we tasted it somewhere else, and Pappy Van Winkle. So Pappy Van Winkle is the one that you described as kind of a small batch, unicorn style, hard to find bourbon.
Right.
I'm going to go with Ancient Age just as a guess because I haven't tasted it. I don't know, but by the name Ancient Age, I'm thinking it's got to be classic.
Okay, and you know what? I think that is a rye bourbon.
Okay, so
I think Elijah Craig is the one.
Elijah Craig is a classic bourbon. For those, again, who are keeping track of these and you want to go check your bar and see if you've got it. Which of the following is considered a wheated bourbon? So the wheated bourbon is the choices W.L. Weller, Knob Creek, Woodford Reserve, or Bullet. Bullet, am I saying it right? Bullet, it's like bullet.
Bullet, yes.
Bullet.
And so
wheated. Well, Maker's Mark is the wheated.
It is.
That's not in the list. So would Woodford Reserve be considered wheated?
Woodford is a classic bourbon.
Oh, that's a classic. Okay. So I'm going to have to guess because I haven't had any of the others. W.L. Weller?
W.L. Weller. That was my father's favorite.
That's right. You mentioned that earlier. Okay. So that's wheated and that's slightly sweet. The wheated, slightly sweeter. Then which is considered a high rye bourbon? Baker's, Old Fitzgerald, Elmer T. Lee, or Breckenridge. So Breckenridge, we by the name means it's probably coming from Colorado.
It is.
So it's a Colorado bourbon, high rye. Well, without tasting it and knowing now I know what I'm looking for. If I taste it, I don't know. I'm going to guess Old Fitzgerald is not the high rye because somewhere in the book you said something like you prefer when it says old, when the word old is in there. then it works better for classic drinks and stuff like that. Am I right about that? You said
for classic,
the word old in the name.
And this is kind of interesting that Old Fitzgerald's is actually a wheated bourbon.
Okay, I'm going to say Breckenridge then would be the rye.
That's correct.
It is? Okay. Only because I don't know, something about Colorado, probably I'm just thinking, all right, they're going to go for more rye, So, all right, well, that's good. And a bourbon that is hard to find might be referred to as, you said earlier, unicorn, right?
A unicorn.
Okay, and let me see, we'll do one more question, and then we're gonna have to have you back and continue this conversation as we get deeper into the world of bourbons. Your tasting kit, I didn't ask this earlier. If you advise everyone to have a tasting kit, it should include which of the following items: a notebook, clear glasses, a classic bourbon, or all of the above. And that's got to be all of the above.
It is all of the above. And so chapter 1 is setting up your testing kit or your tasting kit.
Well, we got into chapter 1. We got a little bit of tastings of the different styles. Albert Schmid, first of all, congratulations on the new book. It's really beautifully written. I love the way it's structured. It's a great teaching tool. Even for somebody who knows nothing about bourbon can, access the world, can enter that very complex world through this book. So it's going to be my go-to, obviously, as I get deeper. And then by the next time we talk, I should be a little bit more, like experienced, and I'll be quoting some of the other more esoteric books that you've listed in your bibliography. But thank you for consolidating all that knowledge and bringing it to us in a great, enjoyable, usable form. And thank all of you for joining us today on Pizza Quest / Bourbon Quest today. Final question for you to get you out of here. Do you have I know you have a lot of different bourbons. Do you have what you would consider your all-time favorite bourbon, or the go-to, or is it more of a mood question?
Well, so I have 3 answers. So the first answer is that I take great pains to not mention my favorite bourbons in the book, because it's prejudice people. I don't want to prejudice people. I also don't want to play favorites. Having said that, what I will say is that the first glass of bourbon that I had when I realized that I could drink bourbon, I was with a really famous master distiller, Lincoln Henderson, who was the first master distiller at Woodford Reserve. And he bought me a glass of bourbon, and I said, hey, listen, I love the gesture. And this was at an IACP conference in San Diego. And I said, but I can't drink it because I'm allergic to corn. Long story short, he said, son, what you're allergic to is distilled out in the process. And so he bought me a glass of bourbon. So one of the great things about that, so Woodford Reserve, it definitely is on my short list, always have it. And the other thing I need to mention... You never
forget your first, right?
Correct. And the other thing I should mention is that Chris Morris, who is the current master distiller emeritus of Woodford Reserve, wrote the foreword to the book.
Oh, that's right. It's a very nice, touching forward. So, and I think in there he mentions also that up until the point where you kind of broke through with the Woodford, you were a gin guy,
right?
So,
and that was a big leap for you.
And I got to say, for somebody who's knows that corn will make you sick, it must have been like a little bit of like, okay, I'm going to trust you here, but get the EpiPen ready in case
right.
I need it,
Exactly.
Well, Albert, it's been great having you, and thank you so much for taking me to the next level. And I look forward to continuing on this journey. And best of success with the book. People can get it now. It's out. It's now officially out, right? The book is out.
It is now out.
So you can get it where your favorite booksellers, whether it's online or your local bookstores. Bourbon 101 by Albert Schmid. Thank you. Thank all of you for joining us today on Pizza Quest. We'll see you at the next episode. Pizza Quest is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network, food radio supported by you. Keep in touch at heritageradionetwork.org/subscribe.